Okay, so, as I said before, I think the objections to utilitarianism get more serious as you go down the list. And so in this lecture, I want to talk about the sort of fourth one on the list, the idea that utilitarianism calls for too much sacrifice. I do think this is a pretty serious objection, and as we'll see, Mill has an answer for it, but I don't think it's actually going to work. I don't think Mill's response is going to work. So what might the answer be? How might a utilitarian respond to this? Okay, but it's important to know what this even is, because it might seem like a weird objection to a moral theory, right? I mean, of course, any moral theory out there is going to say that occasionally you have to give up stuff, right? I mean, look, basic idea of moral theory, sometimes you're going to have to do stuff you don't want to do that's not good for you because it's the right thing to do, right? Ethical egoism might say otherwise, but as we saw, ethical egoism is a pretty dumb moral theory, right? So any moral theory worth its salt is going to occasionally tell you you're going to have to do stuff you don't want to do. You're going to have to make some sacrifices. If a moral theory doesn't say that, it's a pretty good mark that it's not a good theory, right? My grandmother used to say, well, if a sermon doesn't make you feel guilty, preacher's not doing his job. In a very similar way, you might say, well, if a moral theory doesn't occasionally ask you to make sacrifices, it's not doing its job. The problem is, even though a moral theory might ask us to give up some stuff, there seems to be some limits on how much we think it asks in normal cases. So let's see what that is and what that means. Well, look, I hate to use jargon, but I think this is a case where introducing some jargon will help us to introduce the problem. And the jargon I want to throw at you guys is this distinction between what you might call morally required actions and supererogatory actions. I think this distinction will help us to see where the utilitarian runs into problems. So, morally required actions, what we mean by this are things that you must do. We must do them. It's wrong not to do this. So, look, standard prohibitions, standard rules that morality throws out, you must not kill people, right? You must not steal their stuff, right? Or some other things, look, if you see a child drowning in shallow water and you could save him by wading in and getting your pants wet, you have to do it. It would be wrong not to wade into this cold water and pull this child out. Think about this. Any normal human being, if you told them, oh, I saw this child drowning in shallow water, but it's really cold, I like those pants, they'd blame you and say, you are a sociopath. You should have saved this child. It's wrong not to do it. Saving this child, in this case, is a morally required action. Contrast, though, morally required actions with what we'll call supererogatory actions. And what I mean by this is there are some actions that are saintly. They're above and beyond the call of duty. It's very good to do them, but it's not wrong not to do them. No one would blame you if you don't do it. So here's an example, right? Most of you listening to this probably have 2 healthy kidneys. If you do, you could save the life of a complete stranger who's on dialysis, or at least greatly lengthen their life by giving them one of your kidneys. That would be a saintly, wonderful thing to do. If you did it, we would all praise you. We would think that you're a really good person. But on the other hand, we're not going to blame anyone who doesn't go out and donate a kidney to a complete stranger. It's a very good thing to do. It's not morally required. It's not wrong if you don't do it. And I'll give you another example. There are saintly people in the world who work really high-paying jobs just so they'll have more money to give away. These people call themselves effective altruists. They work high-paid, stressful jobs so they can earn as much money as possible, and then they'll go and give practically all of it away to help other people. Well, we might think that this is saintly to do, but I'm not going to blame you for not doing that, right? I'm not going to say, well, you have to give away 90% of your income to help strangers. It's very nice if you do it. It's saintly if you do it. It's not bad not to do it. Well, so what is the problem for utilitarianism? The problem for utilitarianism is it doesn't seem able to draw this distinction. In fact, it looks like utilitarianism is going to make supererogatory actions into morally required ones. Well, why is that? Think about my kidney donation case, right? It would really stink for most of us to have to donate a kidney. It's unpleasant, surgery's not fun. There is some very small chance of bad health impacts. But the thing is, for most of us, the sacrifice we make in donating our healthy kidney would be really outweighed by the level of happiness it would bring somebody on the organ donation list to get a healthy kidney. It'll make us less happy. It'll make them way happier. Honestly, the chances, they've done studies of this, chances of bad effects from donating a kidney really usually not that great. They exist. They're not huge. Most people who donate kidneys are just fine. You could create more happiness by donating your kidney than by keeping it, so utilitarianism would seem to say it's morally required. Or think about your money. There are lots of people in the world who are very badly off. They don't have enough to eat. They might not get decent medical care. They might die of diseases you and I have never heard of. It seems that rather than spending our surplus income on ourselves or those we care about, we could create more happiness by donating it to charities that help these people. People in developing countries who are miserably off, right? Imagine I have $100. Where is it going to create more happiness if I use it to buy myself a nice meal, or several nice meals, or if I use it so bunches of people somewhere in the world have mosquito nets and don't die of malaria? Seems like for any money that I might want to spend on myself, it could always or almost always buy more happiness elsewhere. If that's the case, the utilitarian seems like they would have to say do it. Seems like these, effective altruists, they're not really saintly people. They're just doing what morality requires. Well, that does seem to ask rather a lot from us, right? That we give away all of our income, that we give kidneys to complete strangers, that we do things like that. And I'll note, in the same vein, utilitarianism doesn't allow us to have preference for those that we care about or those that have special relations with us. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that most of us think we owe our children or our parents or our spouses in ways that we don't owe complete strangers. Someone might admit, well, if I took the money I was going to spend on Christmas presents for my children and gave it to charity, it might create more happiness. These other, or I buy toys for other children. These children who might not have any toys will appreciate them more than my kids who do. Nonetheless, I have a special obligation to my own children. It's perfectly okay for me to buy toys for them. It might even be morally bad if I use that money to help complete strangers. That we normally think, right? And I'll give you guys an example here. My grandmother, her stepmother actually once did take and give all of their Christmas presents to complete strangers. Mother Katie, her stepmother, she didn't much like. And I think we can understand why they were mad, right? That's not something you should do. You shouldn't take your own children's Christmas presents, give them to strangers, even if it might make those strangers a little bit happier than it will make your own children. Well, but think about utilitarianism. Can it say that? No, it doesn't seem like it can, right? You should create the most happiness. It doesn't matter whose happiness it is. You're a good utilitarian. You can't prefer your own children to the children of strangers. You can't prefer your wife or husband to a complete stranger. In fact, it's so bad that, imagine this case. If you're a good utilitarian, imagine that your son, who's not particularly talented, he's what they in my hometown would call a ne'er-do-well, is drowning in front of you, and imagine that next to him is a famous research scientist who everyone thinks might be able to cure cancer. The utilitarian, what would they say? They would say you have to save this scientist even if he might be a complete stranger, and let your son drown if that's what it comes to. They would say it would be morally bad not to prefer this complete stranger to your son. That seems to be a problem. What will the utilitarian say about these problems? So Mill's response is basically to just say, well, no, actually, that's not true. Utilitarianism doesn't require that much sacrifice, and utilitarianism actually allows us to show some preference for people closest to us, people we have special relations with. So why does Mill say this? Well, Mill will say, well, look, you can't really do that much to affect the happiness of most people. Your family, your friends, they're right there with you. You can do a lot to affect their happiness. People half a world away, there's not much you can do. Even when it comes to yourself, you can do a lot to make yourself more or less happy. You have way less impact on a guy thousands of miles away. And Mill will say, well, what's more? Not only are we in a better position to affect the happiness of ourselves and those near us, we know better what will make ourselves and those nearest happy. I've got no idea, Mill would say, what will make someone thousands of miles away happy. I know very well what will make my wife happy. Well, does Mill's response stand up? I think the answer is pretty much no. Look, I'm going to cut Mill some slack on this because when he wrote the essay, it was 1863. There really wasn't a whole lot you could do to affect the happiness of people half a world away. By the time you found out there was a famine somewhere, it was probably too late to send aid, and even if it wasn't, the aid might not get there in time. There were no planes, the ships were a lot slower than our ships. And it was a lot harder to get good information on people distant from you, right? There was no internet. There was no video. There was no radio. And, think about like my kidney donation case. You couldn't even donate blood to other people because they hadn't discovered blood types. More often than not, a blood donation would kill the other person. Well, we can't, we don't understand blood types. We certainly can't go donating organs. Here's the thing, though. In the modern world, none of this is true anymore. There is a lot more we can do to help others, even those very far away, than we could do in Mill's time. We can donate money to a reliable charity, Oxfam, the Red Cross. They know where the aid is. They will get it there. People can look at our blood types. They know who could get our kidney and who couldn't. They can do a lot to prevent rejection. So when Mill wrote this, he might have been right. He's not anymore. we have reliable information, and there's a lot we can do. So it seems, given this, in the modern world, it does seem that utilitarianism is going to require huge sacrifices from us. So here's the conditional. If utilitarianism is true, then morality asks much more of us than we initially think. Mill says that's false. I think this is hard to deny. Here's the thing, though. What do we do with this conditional? What is the lesson we might draw from it? Well, look, you might use it to set up an argument like this. If utilitarianism is true, then morality asks much more of us than we initially think. Morality cannot ask this much of us, so utilitarianism is false. Well, you might make that argument, but this whole argument depends on whether you accept premise 2 or not. And I think a committed utilitarian might say, I don't accept premise 2. In fact, there's no good reason to think that premise 2 is true. Think about the history of morality. The whole history of morality, the whole history of moral progress, is us discovering that morality asks more of us than we initially thought. You know, look, an ancient Greek, he didn't think he owed anything, to his slaves. He didn't think he certainly owed anything to foreigners. An ancient Greek man probably didn't think he owed anything to women. He's wrong on all of that, right? He does owe foreigners decent treatment. He shouldn't have slaves. He should treat women equally to himself. If you go back to an ancient Greek, even a very smart one, and say, here's what morality requires of you, he would be just flabbergasted by it, right? Morality asks a lot more of us than he could admit. And a utilitarian might say something similar. They might say, well, guess what? It just turns out that morality asks more of us than even we initially thought, and that's moral progress. So the utilitarian might reject premise 2 and give an argument like this. If utilitarianism is true, then morality asks much more of us than we initially think. Utilitarianism is true, so morality asks much more of us than we initially think. Look, I think premise 1 is hard to deny. Mill tries to, I think he fails. But it's not clear what lesson we should draw from it. We might think it's a good reason to reject utilitarianism, but we might just draw the lesson that morality actually requires more of us than we thought. And we might think that that is moral progress. And in fact, there are people who are good utilitarians, those effective altruists I mentioned, and they would say, I'm just doing the morally decent thing. I earn as much money as possible to help as many people as possible. You should all do likewise. Morality asks it of us, right? There are, in fact, people who've donated kidneys to complete strangers on utilitarian reasoning. And they would say, this is just what morality asks of us. So, long and short of it, Mill's response doesn't work. If we're utilitarians, the theory is going to ask more of us than we think morality does. It's not clear to me that that is a definitive reason to reject utilitarianism, though. Okay, one final point here that I think I'll just add on to this, and then I'll finish this, is what utilitarianism says about animals. What would you think utilitarianism says about animals? What utilitarianism does say is to say that their pleasure and their pain counts. Mill doesn't really discuss this, but Jeremy Bentham, as I said, kind of the founder of the utilitarian school of thought, the guy who Mill builds on a lot of his work, Bentham was very clear on this. If pleasure and pain is what matters, well, Can't animals feel pleasure? Can't animals feel pain? If that's so, why doesn't their suffering and their pleasure count? In fact, Bentham will say that animals' suffering counts just as much as that of human beings. And Bentham will also say, look, if you're a utilitarian, it's hard not to also be a vegetarian because, is the suffering animals undergo for us to eat meat? Is that outweighed by the pleasure we get from it? Maybe it's an open question, but it's kind of hard to say that the pain on one hand doesn't outweigh the pleasure on the other. So if you're a utilitarian, probably that would push you toward vegetarianism, some other stuff that goes under this idea of animal rights. At the very least, if you're a utilitarian, you have to take the suffering of animals very seriously. Again, I think the utilitarian would just say this is another way that utilitarianism might mark moral progress. We are prone to ignoring the suffering of animals or weighing it much less heavily than human suffering. The utilitarian would say that's just as arbitrary as the ancient Greek not caring about the suffering of foreigners or the suffering of his slaves, right? He's wrong about that. If you're a utilitarian, you will say we are wrong not to take the suffering of animals seriously. Anyway, maybe you're not a utilitarian, but if you are, animal suffering must be taken seriously.